Aloha, everyone, and welcome back to Human Biology here at Chaminade University. Today we are going to be discussing your hair, skin, and nails, which comprise the integumentary system and function as a protective barrier between your internal environment and your external environment. So they serve to protect you from microbes, etc., that might be in your external environment, and to help maintain your temperature balance, to help store your nutrients, and the tactile sensory sensation, basically the ability to sense your external environment via touch. Also going to be involved in excretion of certain wastes and also secretion of things like sweats, which will allow you to maintain your temperature. So going back to number 2 here. And last but not least, it's involved in metabolism, namely in the creation or the synthesis of vitamin D. Now, you have 3 major layers of skin. The outer layer is your epidermis, the middle layer is your dermis, and the innermost layer is called the hypodermis. And they're comprised of 3 different epithelial layers, which we've described in the lecture about tissues. But the layers of squamous epithelial that they have, layers of epithelial that they have are going to be keratinized, stratified, and squamous epithelial. It's also got 3 major cell types, namely keratinocytes, which are going to create keratin, which is going to be very strong, melanocytes, which are going to create the nice color, pigmentation in your hair, Langerhans cells, and Merkel cells as well. And we'll talk about those in a little bit. Now we have 2 major types of skin as well. So we have the skin that is found on the palms of our hands and the soles of our feet. That's our thick skin. It's got 5 layers, so it has an additional very tough layer that is not found in the rest of our body, which has thin skin, which has approximately 4 layers. It's going to be avascular, and the base layer is going to be the deepest. So here's the thin skin. The thin skin is going to be comprised first of the stratum basale, which is the basal layer, then the spinosum, then the granulosum, then the corneum, which is the outermost layer. And thick skin is going to have an extra layer. So it's going to have that stratum basale, right? Then the spinosum, granulosum, and then it has the lucidium and then the corneum. All right, so what's in each of these layers? So the stratum basale is going to be the basal layer, which is going to be replenishing all of the skin cells above it. So it's a single row of comprised of keratinocytes. They divide very quickly, also comprised of some melanocytes and Merkel cells, and they're going to reproduce and create more skin that's going to be pushing upward. And as we travel upward, we're going to be going through these layers here, namely the spinosum, granulosum, lucidium, and corneum. Okay, so when I'm talking about the 3 major layers, here's what I'm talking about. Here's the epidermal layer, this is the dermis, and here's the sub-Q layer. Now the epidermal layer is what I was talking about being avascular. This dermal layer does have vasculature. It's going to have nerve endings here. It's also going to be where a hair root shaft is going to go all the way through. We're going to get here. Now the hair root's going to be serviced by its own little vasculature, and it's also typically going to have its own nervous supply. It also is going to have these muscles here, so rector pili muscles, that are going to help pull those hairs up to give you that goosebump sensation, perhaps when you're chilly or have gotten frightened. What else do we have here? We have some sebaceous glands, which are going to be basically oil glands. That's going to allow the hair to come up out of that shaft with ease. Here's a Myciner corpuscle. It's going to allow us a sensation of touch on the surface. We also are going to have some other glands here. Here's some sweat glands. That's going to lead right on out here, out towards the hair shaft. What else am I missing? Okay, I think I've covered, the adipose tissue, I guess I didn't touch on that. It's going to be a layer of fat tissue that's found in the sub-Q layer, which is where most of our vasculature is going to originate from, and then stem upward through the dermal layer to service up here the dermal papillae. You'll note that the dermal papillae are going to interact with the epidermal ridge almost exactly, right? Kind of like a lock and key fit, and that it's not going to be a nice straight line. It actually is going to be very wavy here. It's going to create, like I said, those ridges. If you're looking at the layers that we were talking about previously, here's our stratum basale, which is going to then create these next layers, which are going to get a little bit less alive, basically, as we head towards the top. This top layer is going to be almost entirely dead skin that can be sloughed off. All right, so when we're talking about the layers of skin, okay, here we start with the stratum basale. That's going to be the area of the epidermis that's going to be touching, basically, the dermal layer. It's going to have, again, keratinocytes. Here's a Merkel cell, which is going to be involved in the sense of sensation or touch, right? It's a tactile cell. Here we have a melanocyte. It's going to create color or coloration. We also have some Langerhans cells here. These are keratinocytes. And basically what happens is the stratum basale is going to create new cells. Those cells are going to become the stratum spinosum. And then as they age, they're going to become the stratum granulosum and start to kind of die off. If we have that extra layer of skin, we're going to get that stratum lucidium, right? And then the top layer is going to be that stratum corneum. And the very top there, we're going to have those dead keratinocytes. They're just going to kind of slough off. And this is what they use when they get skin cells from whatever for CSI, right? They can still get the DNA out of it even though the cells are dead. So again, from the superficial layer, we're going to have the stratum corneum headed inward towards the deep layer. We'll end up with the stratum basale. Okay, we have a pretty large papillary network, which is there to be able to support the epidermal layer and nourish the epidermal layer. We also have some areolar connective tissue, which is going to include cells like fibroblast cells, and then some extracellular matrix molecules like collagen, reticular fibers, elastin fibers, etc. We also have those dermal papillae. Remember, they're going to go directly into those epidermal ridges and fit like a smooth little lock and key. And the dermal ridges are actually going to create little patterns on your hands and on your feet that are known as your fingerprints. Again, we also have the reticular layer, so they have the papillary layer and then the reticular layer. The reticular layer is going to have a lot of extracellular matrix molecules as well, collagen and elastic fibers, etc. And this is going to allow this region to serve as a point of attachment as well as have a good bit of flexibility. So again, this collagen elastin is going to have a extensibility or flexibility and elasticity. And sometimes if we have extensibility that happens on a rapid rate, like during pregnancy, for example, we can end up with what's called stretch marks. Now, stretch marks are going to be a specific type of scar that are going to form on the surface of the skin, basically when the skin grows too quickly, again, during pregnancy, etc. And so the dermal layer tears, and one of those quick and dirty mechanisms for the body to heal is with scar tissue, right, which is going to be fibroblasts. So the fibroblasts are going to come right into those tears and fill in the gaps quickly to allow us to expand that region quickly for something like a pregnancy, but then we'll leave marks afterwards where we have fibroblasts that have kind of taken in and covered that up forever. So these are going to be fingerprints. We have multiple different types of fingerprints. This is from like an old detective book, right? Clearly from the old patterning. But here's a whorl. This is a loop, which is not quite a full circle. And then this is just an arch, which goes up and down. And this is all different types of formations that you can get from epidermal ridges. And these are unique to an individual. Okay, so let's talk about pigmentation in your skin, which is what gives you your skin color. And we have three major types of pigmentation, including melanin, hemoglobin, and keratin. Melanin is going to be the nice dark color. Hemoglobin is going to give a red color. Keratin is going to be kind of like an orange-brown. And when we are going to get a tattoo, for example, the tattoo ink has to go through the epidermal layer into the dermal layer, right? In the epidermal layer, cell turnover is so quick that we're just going to lose any of the ink in that top layer. So if we don't get all the way down into the dermis, then we're not going to be able to actually have that ink stick around for a long period of time. If we go too far, we get into that sub-Q layer, which is basically fat tissue, and that's when we start running because the fat tissue doesn't really hold it well. It just kind of gets dispersed in that whole layer. So that's if you see a tattoo that seems to have kind of run underneath the skin, the tattoo's artist might have gone down too far into the sub-Q layer, which again is a lot of adipose or fat tissue. All right, but I digress. Let's talk about tactile sensations. So we can have a sensation of pressure, or pain, or temperature, or like vibration, and those all have different corpuscles or nerve endings or receptors that are going to be detecting these different changes in the external environment. So we have something called the Passinian Corpuscules. These are going to detect pressure. So something like a heavy weight on your lap or a textbook on your lap or when a cat jumps up on your lap. We also have nociceptors. Nociceptors are going to be nerve endings that detect pain. So if that cat jumps on your lap and also uses its claws, for example. But then when that cat starts to warm up, you can detect the temperature change on your lap via thermoreceptors, which are basically going to detect the temperature of your external environment. And when that cat starts purring, you're going to have mycin corpuscles that are going to start vibrating. These guys are going to be responsible for detection of touch and vibration. All right, so let's talk about glands. Glands are responsible for secretion, and glands are basically going to be any time that we have an opening to the external environment that we are eliminating something. So here's an example of an oil gland. It's going to be right next to our hair follicle. We also have a sweat gland. It's going to also leak out through that hair follicle. And then we have eccrine glands, which is a pseudophorous sweat gland, which is going to go directly to the skin surface and not go out by way of the follicle. So that's the difference between apocrine secretion. Apocrine secretion is going to find its way into like a hair shaft or some other secondary mechanism to get out, whereas an eccrine gland is going to find its way directly to the surface. But either way, what's going to happen, we're going to be expelling in this case sweat. And you can remember pseudophorous, doesn't have the word odor in it, but if you rearrange it, you can see odor pretty easily. So sebaceous glands are going to be oil glands. They're going to create something called sebum, which is like a nice oily substance. We also have sweat glands, which are pseudophorous glands, and ceremoneous glands, ceremoneous glands, and these are going to be the glands in your ears that are going to produce that thick substance like earwax, and that's also going to help be a protective layer to help get everything out, right, working its way outward, but it can end up building up on the inside and have to be removed. All right. So as we follow the rest of the chapter, let's think about the following scenario. So we have an individual named Bert who hit a hole in the road and fell off of his bike. So he slid along the gravel shoulder and he scraped up his whole right side of his body. So he not only saw blood, but he also saw muscle exposed beneath the skin. So which layers of skin were likely affected? And if we were thinking about this in the similarity to someone like a burn victim who has also had severe damage to the skin, what are the two major things that a first aid person attending to Bert or Bert himself should be aware of? All right, so let's move on to burns. Burns can be described as superficial, partial, or full thickness. Now, a superficial burn is going to be the lightest of the burns, which does not mean that it's not painful. A severe sunburn can be extremely painful and still be superficial. Basically, what happens is we have damage to the epidermal layer, but it hasn't reached the dermis. Now, if we have a partial thickness burn, we've got the epidermis involved, but we also have the papillary region of the dermis, at least that top layer of the dermis. Remember that papillary region is going to be where we have the dermal ridges that go to interact with the epidermal, so dermal papillae interacting with the epidermal ridges. And this is also when we're going to start seeing blistering of the skin. So that top layer of skin is going to actually peel off from the stratum basale, and a bunch of liquid is going to pool there. That's going to form what we call these blisters. As a side note, you ought never to pop these blisters on your own because they're actually going to still form a protective layer between the internal and external environment. And as long as it's sealed, then you have less of a chance of infection. Once it's opened up, then you've allowed things to crawl in there, and now you have secondary risk of infection, etc. Which you'll know if you start treating these burns in the ER as nurses. So you'll start recognizing when people might have a risk of infection because they have an open wound here instead of just having a burn that's going to have that still sealed protective layer. Now, if we have a full thickness burn, we're going to go all the way through the epidermis and the dermis and get into that subcutaneous layer. Sometimes we can get all the way down to that underlying muscle tissue, and these are going to be severely damaged burns. Here's an example over here. These kind of burns can sometimes require skin grafts in order to heal. And also, if we're treating an individual with burns, we use something called the rule of nines. Now, with the rule of nines, we divide the body up into the quadrants of the legs. The lower limbs are each worth 9 in the front and 9 in the back, so that gives us 18 for each of these limbs. The arms are each worth 4.5 in the front and 4.5 in the back, so that means that they're each worth 9 for each of those limbs. The head, same thing, is worth 9, 4.5 in the front, 4.5 in the back. Body is worth 9 in the upper quadrants in the front and the back, and also 9 in the upper and lower quadrants in the back. And then 1% is going to be the groin area. And this can be a quick and dirty way to assess how much skin an individual is lost in a burn injury, so how severe the trauma might be, particularly if you're dealing with a triage situation where you have multiple people presenting with injuries that might be of varying degrees, but you can do a quick and dirty assessment of how much of the surface of their body has been injured and triage them in that way. Okay, so what happens when your skin cells that are supposed to replicate constantly, right? You're always cutting yourself, you might need to constantly regenerate, you're always losing skin cells even if you're not cutting yourself. But what happens when that goes awry? So we can end up with different types of skin cancer. And depending on which of the cells in this setup are going to end up going awry, we can have skin cancer described as basal cell, squamous cell, or melanoma cancer. which basically can lead to different prognosis and different sets of treatments, right? So the basal cell is going to be cells that come from that basal layer. It's going to be the most common type. It's usually caused by excessive skin exposure. We can also have squamous cell cancers, which happens with the keratinocytes in that area of the spinosum layer. It typically can spread very quickly, but it's usually easy to remove, and it's also going to be caused by excessive sun exposure. So although they do replicate very quickly, they don't actually get very deep, and they're not as fast to metastasize as other types of cancers. Now, melanoma, this one is the most dangerous. It's actually the least common, but it's the one that has the most severe outcome. It can be fatal if untreated. It's when the melanocytes are going to start reproducing very quickly, and they actually can travel and then cause secondary metastases. So this is going to be one of the most dangerous types of skin cancer. Anyway, if you have a mole that changes shape, use the ABCDEs and get it looked at as soon as possible. What are the ABCDEs? So the ABCDEs are the indications that a mole might be melanoma. Is it asymmetrical with irregular borders? Is it dark in color, right? Melanin is going to be the main molecule inside the melanocytes, so melanomas can tend to be dark. It also is going to have a diameter that's larger than 6 millimeters, which is basically your regular pearl necklace, and it changes over time. So the borders are irregular and they're going to start changing, so evolution. And if we see all of these, we absolutely need to see a skin doctor or a dermatologist. All right, so how does this affect our skin as we age? Right? So one of the most common effects that happens as we age is that we get wrinkles in our skin, right? We lose the extracellular matrix molecules like the collagen and the elastin, the reticular fibers. We also are going to end up with age spots, right? When melanocytes start and keratinocytes start growing at odd rates, they start making these odd little patches that create age spots. We can end up with sagging skin, again, because of the lack of support from these extracellular matrix molecules. We can have blood vessels that appear underneath the skin, skin tags that pop up, and also skin dryness. And oftentimes this happens, again, because we have less of these extracellular matrix molecules like collagen and elastin being produced. So the skin is not going to be as strong as it was before. It's going to become thinner, a little bit less flexible, a little bit more brittle. Additionally, the sebaceous glands are going to become less active, so we're going to end up with less oil on our skin. So that's going to leave our skin dry, and that's going to allow the appearance of wrinkles to become more apparent. So what's going to increase how quickly you appear to age? Well, exposure to toxins. Cigarette smoke is a big one. Cigarette smokers always look 10 years older by the time they're in their 50s and 60s than non-smokers. Also, excessive sun exposure can cause damage to your skin. Exposure to toxins like pollution, or just general inattentive to your bodily needs, like your need for sleep and rest and exercise, etc. So how can we offset this? We can pay attention and take the right vitamins, pay attention to nutrition, utilize things like antioxidants, take your daily vitamins, which should include things like vitamin A, C, and E, etc. And exercise daily. Keep yourself in your ideal nutritional zone to keep your ideal blood flow and hormone production levels at the right levels for your age and body type. Okay, so let's go back to that application that we talked about previously. Since we're able to see Bert's muscle tissue, he's damaged all 3 layers of his skin, including the dermis, epidermis, and subcute layer. Remember, epidermis is the outer layer, dermis is the middle, and subcute is the bottom layer. And that means he's probably going to have considerable scarring when his skin starts healing. And so that's similar to having the damage occurring with a burn, where we're having to have the skin completely regrow. So the risk of water loss and temperature loss are going to be pretty high. So right there on the spot, this individual, especially severe burns, can be at risk for going into hypothermia or temperature shock, low temperature shock. So you want to make sure that as a triage professional, that you make sure that you get them one of those foil blankets, etc. We also want to make sure secondarily that we treat the risk of infection, because we've lost that first barrier to the external environment. And so any microbes that may have been introduced, particularly if you've got road rash, right, you've gone down into a pretty dirty environment, that all might be introduced into the skin. So you want to make sure that they are going to treat the potential infection that may arise from that. All right, everyone. So thank you so very much for coming to class today. I appreciate your attention. So aloha and happy studying.